So awesome. So I just want to introduce our speaker for tonight. Again, thank you all for coming to our last lecture segment for Islam Awareness Week. I wanted to introduce our speaker for tonight, Tahera Ahmad. She is from Morton Grove and studied classical and traditional Islamic studies at IIE. She also did her graduate studies in Arabic at Al-Diwan and Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt, and also did her graduate studies in Hartford Theological Seminary in Egypt, or in Connecticut. She has been also featured in various media outlets, and the most recent, which was the PBS documentary called The Calling. And she's also been recognized by President Obama for all her work, and currently serves as a faculty fellow and associate chaplain at Northwestern University. So if everyone could please welcome Tahera Ahmad.
Assalamu alaikum, which means greetings of peace to all of you. Shalom alaikum to my Jewish friends and all the urbanites?
Townies,
yeah. Hi, or howdy, or whatever you want. So I thought what would be good, originally I had planned to show the video a little bit later, but because of time and I don't know, how many of you actually have like another class to get to after this? What time is that? Like 6:30-ish? 6:36. Okay, so I'm actually going to go to the video first. So the video, some of you may have seen it already. It's not too long, it's pretty short, but what it's going to do is allow us to have conversation around this idea of covering in general, right? But the woman, there are two women in this interview, both of them are actually quite well known. One of them is a journalist. One of them actually covers her face, and the other is also a Muslim woman, and she is also a journalist. But the perspectives are really, really interesting. And I think it will be a great starter for us as we begin this conversation around veiled liberation. So let me know if it's
Debates over integrating devout Muslims into society are not unique to the United States. Effective today, it is illegal to wear a burqa in France or a niqab like this. A Muslim veil that reveals only the eyes. The new law drew protest and confusion on the streets of Paris. Two women stepping out in their niqabs and drawing a crowd were arrested for staging an unauthorized protest. The French government has called the veils, and I quote, a new form of enslavement, end quote, not acceptable on its soil. Many Muslims are enraged, but not all. I'm joined by Tahera Ahmad, a writer for the blog Muslim Matters, who's against the ban. She's in Albuquerque. And Mona El-Tahawi, a columnist on Arab and Muslim issues, who wants to see the ban extended everywhere. She's joining me from Washington. Welcome to you both. Let me begin, by, if I might, by quoting President Sarkozy of France in his justification for the law. It's kind of a remarkable statement. He says, and I quote, this is the President of France, "The burqa is not a religious symbol. It's a sign of enslavement, of debaseness. I want to say this solemnly. The burqa will not be welcome on the territory of the French Republic. We cannot accept in our country women imprisoned behind a mask, deprived of all social life, of their identity." So Mona, let me start with you. You want to extend this ban across the world. Do you agree with President Sarkozy that merely because somebody wants to dress like this, they choose to dress like this, they shouldn't be permitted to do so?
You know, Elliot, I detest Nicolas Sarkozy. I consider him right-wing and racist, but I also detest the niqab and I detest the face veil. And I say this as a Muslim woman. I think it represents an ideology that does not believe in Muslim women's rights to do anything but choose to cover her face. And I find that, I believe that the niqab dangerously equates piety with the disappearance of women. And so I support banning it everywhere because it's not in the Quran, it's not an obligation for a Muslim woman to cover her face. And my talk with you now, with you seeing my face, is going to be very different than if I was sitting here with my face covered. I believe the human face is central to communication.
Okay, Mona, the only thing I would observe, and I want to give Heba a chance to jump in, of course, but I heard you use the singular personal pronoun I many times, that I have no doubt you believe that, but why should your beliefs ban other people from wearing what they want to wear? That's what I don't get. Heba, explain to me why you think the ban is a bad idea.
I think that it's a bad idea because I think it's yet another example of men telling women how to dress, how to live their life. It's another way to try to control women, and to take it to a government level and to try to legislate the way that a woman dresses is not just wrong and against human rights, but it really violates the whole basis that the democracy and democratic countries are based on. This is a free choice. This is something that I choose to wear. I disagree that it's some right-wing ideology. It is something that is permitted in Islam. I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and I am free to do whatever I want, and this is a choice that I want to make. And just because somebody doesn't accept my interpretation of Islam or personally like it, doesn't mean that we can use laws to violate people's freedom of expression and freedom of religion.
But let me just ask you this. When you go to the airport, you understand there are going to be obligations. They're going to have to check you for security like they check all the rest. When you get a driver's license, they take a picture with or without your veil on.
Absolutely. I want everyone to know that as a Muslim woman, as a Muslim in America, I am just as concerned about safety and security as everybody else, and I have no problem whatsoever accommodating any security issues that come about when I enter a bank, when I go to the airport, when I go to the DMV. I show my face, and actually in Islam, we are required to show our identity when we're in a court system giving testimony. This is absolutely something that is essential for the security and identification of people, but that doesn't mean that I should be banned completely from what I choose to do.
Okay, Mona, let me jump in here. There are lots of types of dress that I look at and I don't like them. I think they're degrading. I think they're oppressive. Lots of things that I see teenagers wearing that, I'm now viewed as old-fashioned by a lot of, my kids perhaps. I don't go around saying we should pass a law banning it. Isn't that fundamentally violative of the First Amendment? What possible reason can there be legally to say to somebody, you can't dress the way you want to dress?
Actually, Elliot, the government does tell people how they can and can't dress all the time. You cannot walk outside naked. There are many states here in the US where 3 or more people cannot be together in public with wearing a face mask. So the government actually does legislate over our wardrobe, but everybody conveniently forgets that. I would like to ask Heba, once I'm done talking, if she works, because we've been on media shows together where we've been on opposite ends of this argument. And I know from what she said before that once she started covering her face, she stopped working. So my argument is that this is not just about I understand what the point that you were making earlier, Elliot. Feminist groups, many women's rights groups, have made the point that what the niqab does in a society, especially for Muslim women, is that it creates a spectrum where that is the pinnacle of piety and that is the good Muslim woman. And so of course it affects me. In France, where this ban is going in effect, Muslim women's rights groups there support it because they find that Muslim women who live in the French housing projects have been put under tremendous pressure by the Muslim right wing to give into the niqab. And when they speak out, they are told, it's basically they become these political pawns.
Yeah,
that's why I said I oppose Sarkozy, but I oppose this on women, because what choice do women have besides covering their face? This ideology doesn't recognize Muslim women's rights.
Mona, I just have to push you on one thing here. There are certain prohibitions on the way people dress, or you mentioned nudity, that don't dress, that are in fact imposed upon us by law, but none of them that I'm aware of relates to a specific religion and says if you are a devout member of a religion, you cannot dress in a way that you are obligated to practice your religion, your choice of faith. Can you think of any example like that? Because I can think of 1,000 other laws, if this were upheld, that suddenly we would limit all sorts of things that people do for their religious beliefs because we don't agree with it. Wouldn't that be a very dangerous thing to do?
See, this is, I think, where these right-wing interpretations of religion get a free pass, because everybody says, well, it's my religious obligation, it's my religious right to do this. Let's look really at what we're talking about here. We're talking about the disappearance of women justified in the name of them becoming closer to God. So the closer you want to become to God, the less of you, the more you disappear.
I don't feel that I have disappeared at all.
Well, one at a time.
I disagree.
Guys, one at a time. Heba, jump in. Tell us, has anybody forced you to do this? Is this something you're doing of your own free will?
Nobody has forced me to do this, and I really have to disagree with the statistics that Mona is trying to put forth, because studies have shown that there are only 2,000 women in France that wear the niqab. The majority of them are converts who converted to Islam and are voluntarily choosing to do it. This is my choice. Nobody can force me to take it off. I would not take it off even if you paid me to do it. And the fact of the matter is that I have never met a single Muslim woman in all of my travels around the world that is being forced to wear it. I understand Mona does not like it and does not want to wear it personally, but she keeps talking about her own feelings about it, and she wants to use the law to support it. If she wants a diversity in Islamic belief, then she has to accept my version just like she wants me to accept hers.
Mona, let me ask you this question. Do you have any evidence to support your statement that women are forced to wear this? And let me ask you this. If the women are being forced to do something they don't want to do, there is recourse other than banning this entire mode of dress that is chosen, as we just heard from him, by people who do choose to wear it of their own free will.
Well, you know, I lived in Saudi Arabia. Heather says that she's traveled the world and she's never met a woman who's been forced to wear it. I lived in Saudi Arabia where millions of women are forced to cover their face. But now that the argument will be, well, that's in Saudi Arabia, not in France. What choice does a woman have when she's told she will burn in hell if she doesn't cover every inch of her body? What kind of a choice is that? So of course these women who convert to this ideology,
I've never heard anybody say that.
The women who convert to this ideology, who are then told that this is how to be a good Muslim woman, to be close to God, to avoid hellfire, is there really a choice in that? And I believe when you have a law like this, you know, I told you I detest Sarkozy, I consider him racist, but I will not sacrifice Muslim women's rights in order to uphold the Muslim right wing, which I believe is misogynist. With a law like that, a woman can tell her husband or any male relative who is forcing her to dress like this, the law says I don't have to dress like this.
Mona, well, let's not deal with Saudi Arabia, different customs, different laws. We have a First Amendment.
No, I was talking about France. I was talking about France.
Wait, hold on 1 second. In the United States, we have a First Amendment that gives people the right to practice religion as they wish. Do you not think that a law that in the United States that would ban this form of dress would violate the First Amendment permission to practice religion as each individual sees fit?
Well, this comes back to religion again. Everything is allowed just because someone says it's their religious belief. You know what I mean?
No. Mona, you're going to jump in. You go 1 second. It's banned or permitted until there is some compelling state interest on the other side, but it's got to be an overwhelming interest. What is the overwhelming interest that would justify us in banning the type of dress that people choose as a result of their religion?
Well, all the reasons I just gave you, but I will repeat. I believe that this is genuinely harmful to Muslim women because it creates this pinnacle of piety in which a Muslim woman is told, this is the closest you can get to God, and she's disappeared. I'm no longer here. You don't even know who I am. The face is central to communication. And not just that, it objectifies women. The pinnacle of objectification.
Look, I agree with much of what you're saying, but not as a matter of law. Hey, but, you know, you get the last word. You haven't gotten a fair time on this one. Give it, that's 15 seconds you've got.
Thank you. Basically, I want people to know that when I choose to cover this way, it's because I am fighting against a systematic oppression against women in which women's bodies are being sexualized and objectified. This is a different perspective and a different form of empowerment in which I think when I'm in public, my sexuality is in my control and people have to deal with my brain and who I really am and not judge me by my body. And if we want to really talk about the oppressive situation of women, let's talk about all of the eating disorders, all of the plastic surgery, all of the unhealthy diets that are being done, all in the name of having the perfect body. To me, this is liberating and this is empowering. Mona keeps saying, I believe, I believe, I believe. Well, we don't make laws based on what Mona believes or what anybody believes.
All right, guys.
It's based on whether or not...
This is clearly not an issue we're going to resolve in the next 10 seconds. I want to thank you both, Tahera Ahmad and Mona El-Tahawi. Clearly a passionate and important debate.
Okay, any quick thoughts on that before we get started into the actual presentation? Was that interesting?
Yeah.
How many of you have seen that before? Oh my God. Okay. A few of you have. Okay. But majority of you didn't. So I think that was good. Any initial thoughts on that? Yes. What's your name?
My name's Molly, and just like for a disclaimer, I have seen this before, but I don't know that much about it. I do want to say that even whenever I first saw it, my initial reaction is the whole idea for not having it as oppression of women, by then telling them, now we're going to pick what you can and can't wear, that's just changing who gets to oppress the women, but they're still being oppressed. So if the issue is you feel like they're being enslaved, you feel like it's oppression, there's other ways to go about talking to them and trying to educate them for whatever reasons to lead to that solution than oppressing them just in a different format.
Okay, that's a really good point, Mom. Anyone else? Yeah.
I've never
What's
seen
your
the
name?
video.
Well, I know your name, but you can say your name.
My name's Yelena. I've never seen this video before.
Okay.
But it gets me wondering, you know, I imagine there are plenty of women who wear the niqab or the burqa that are doing it of their own free will. There are probably also some who are being coerced to wear it. And the question is, whose rights are more important, essentially? And that's not really a fair question, but that's kind of the question that the people in the video were asking.
Wow, that's a really, did everyone understand what she said? It's a really good way to put it. Anyone else want to chime in? Yeah. What's your name?
My name's Mama, but I just feel like the whole thing of talking about Muslim women's rights in regards to the hijab, I just feel like if like someone is being forced to wear it, there's probably a lot of other problems that are going on that need to be resolved first rather than covering their face. Like I just feel like it's going on a completely different topic. Like the whole underlying issue of like the media press, like I just don't feel like it's relevant. I know that other people think it's hard to ban that first when they should be just solving the issue of the media press in the first place.
Okay, wow, that's a really good point too. I forget, like, your average ACT, SAT scores, like, supposed to be like pretty high here, right? Mine is like, no, so we'll talk about that. Did you have something else? Can you speak a little louder?
So in regards to like which rights are more important, so like is it more important to make sure that those who are forced to wear it don't have to wear it, or whether those who want to wear it do? I just feel like there's so many other things that women are forced to do as well that you may not like see. Like for instance, like I know a lot of people say they want to wear the term, their family's like, no, you can't wear it, so they're forced not to. And even like in other things, like media-wise, we hear a lot of times it's like I don't want to dress this way, but in order to do something, they're really coming dressed. Society sometimes forces you to do things as well. So like it's unfair to just focus on like this one aspect of it.
Right. What was your name?
Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. One last person. Maybe a guy could chime in. I'm really happy to see the 5 men in here. Yay. There should be more men in here, actually. But it's all good. Either side. There's like a white side and a brown side. No, like, I was just kidding. Totally. Either one.
Okay,
What's your name?
I'm Ismail. They both use the term oppression, but I see oppression as when people are trying to make you do something you don't want to. So, for me, if I'm a lady and I want to decide whether to wear hijab or not, it's my journey. And I don't want to be influenced by people who don't know the subject first. So I think both of them are influencing my judgment, and I don't know anything about them. So first I will know whether they qualify to teach me, and then probably make assessment.
Okay. Okay, thanks for all the feedback. I was just making sure that we were able to kind of turn the wheels around this topic, because although the hijab, she's talking about the niqab, right? She's talking about the face veil, which is almost like another conversation. We're primarily focusing on the head veil, which some of you, I was told, are trying out for the first time. Yeah. Sure. What's your name?
Solomon. I personally, I'm against the niqab just because, like, in a society that we're in now, you don't know who's under it, so that's, but we shouldn't take it away from the people that want to wear it for a religious reason. But I mean, in the society that we live now, I mean, anybody can go and put one on, and I mean, it's kind of scary. You don't know who's under there. Could be a guy under there. But they were saying though,
Yeah, man, we don't know.
but they were saying in the video, like, I don't think they argued it enough that like what the other girls,
Mana?
yeah, when I was. No, the other.
Hiba.
Yeah, no, Hiba. I don't think she had the right argument. I don't think she presented the right argument. I mean,
You mean from a theological perspective or from the sociological perspective?
sociological.
Really? Okay.
Because she referred back to like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I mean, the women there, like, they're looked at that they're going through it, or it's more free for them to wear. Like there's more of them that wear it than here in the United States. And then I think that her arguments about that, putting that into it, was just off. I mean, she could have used other arguments to explain why they should have been wearing it.
Okay, so essentially Mona is making the argument that they're not even talking too much about theology. And by that I mean like they're not looking at scripture, what's the verse, or what did the prophet of Islam, the last prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, say, right? They're not even like approaching the theological perspective. They were talking more about like sociologically, like why it's a problem, right? So the Mona is basically making the case that women who wear this are it's almost like they've disappeared from society. They can't really participate in society in the same way that a woman who is not covered, at least not her face. And on the other side, Heba's making the case that, well, no, in a free society, I'm able to do what I want. I have a master's degree in chemical engineering, so on and so forth. But I guess what Solomon is saying is that that piece wasn't really talked about much, meaning like, well, how much are you able to participate, or how much are you not? And then, does it actually bring harm into her life and into the life of others, right? And then to a certain extent, though, to the credit of Hiba, she does explain that, well, within Islamic law, there is conversation around when you go into a court case, for example, or when there's a safety issue. Like when you go to the airport, I've seen it many times. Women who wear the niqab are actually escorted. The TSA personnel requests to see their face. There's 2 of them. They'll go in, usually, obviously female, and they just want to ensure that it's the same person that's on the ID, and then they, move along. The issue, of course, is of like, well, God forbid one day a couple of people decide that they're going to blow up something and they do it with veils on in the way Muslim women do. No ideas. Please don't start that. You guys are all like really serious. If that, God forbid, if that happens, of course it's going to create a real concern, right? Of, well, who's behind these veils? It's already a concern in some places. For example, university settings. I've had deans contact me, not at Northwestern, but other places, who say, well, I don't know, like a professor is saying, well, I don't know who that person is in that chair, and how can I find that out? Of course, my first response was, well, in a 300-room classroom, unless you've memorized everybody's face, how do you know that Jonathan A.C. Brown was Jonathan A.C. Brown when he took the test? There's IDs and all of that, I understand that, but like, Ahmed, a white Ahmed could have sat in Jonathan's face, right, and took that exam without the professor really knowing. That's the counter-argument, obviously. But the case can go back and forth around the concept of harm, okay? So the harm to the self as well as harm to others. You can't really do much around the topic of harm to self because that's an individual choice. But when it becomes harmful to others in society, that's where Islamic law even steps in, right? So anyway, that's an extended conversation. We can talk more about that. But what I wanted to do actually is kind of take us step by step into this conversation around why Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab, why do they choose to wear the hijab, and what does it mean for them? And then some of you who actually wore it for the first time today, right? Is that true? Okay. Maybe we can get a reaction from you all as well into this entire conversation. I'm hopeful that this will be more of a workshop style, like I like interaction with the audience. And again, like with what Solomon said, for example, he felt like saying what his opinion was. So if you are feeling something and you think like, this is a safe space, so you feel free to say whatever, it's not going to be seen as a bias or something, as long as you don't like curse me out. So like, I'm just going to go ahead and state that. So this is the common image, right, of a Muslim woman. And I'm not just making this up. Gallup and Pew both did research on this, right? And they asked the average American, so about 64% of Americans, when they were asked, what is the image of a Muslim woman? And they were given cards, okay? They flipped the cards. And then basically they chose this one. A majority of them chose, 64% of them chose this card, okay? They had an image of somebody who was dressed like Mona, an image of somebody who was dressed like me, and then an image like that. Okay, so can you imagine, the majority of them actually chose that image, not even the image of just a woman wearing hijab. So that tells you something, right? That the common American, or the average American, living in the West, has this particular image of Muslim women. And then again, there's some common misconceptions. What do you think some of those are? okay, being forced to cover, not just about covering, other issues. Like somebody here said, what was your name? Maha said, well, there are probably more issues going on, right? And so there are, those issues actually do exist, but some of them are also misconceptions. What are they? Yeah.
Not giving equal rights.
Okay, not given equal opportunities, yeah.
Like moments that they kind of disappear, they're just not involved in socially.
Okay, so not like contributing to society or active members of society.
Maybe people think have like a lack of education.
Lack of education, thank you.
Arranged marriage.
Yeah, that's a big one. Arranged marriage. I was just on a retreat. Every single person who was not Muslim on that retreat at some point asked me, so, was your marriage arranged? And I was like, it was a hybrid. Talk about that later. It just means my parents were involved. Yes?
That they're like sad.
They're depressed, yeah. They're like, they can't have fun or something. Yes. Un-American? Oh, that's a really good one, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, so we'll just go through them for the sake of time. Okay, arranged marriages, someone said that. Abused by men in the family, no one said that, but that's a very common misconception. Forced to cover, forced to stay at home, all of these are pretty much covered. Okay, so why do you think they exist? Yes?
There's no like mainstream person that can be like, oh, that woman's Muslim and I know her from popular media.
That's interesting.
That fits my, like maybe someone is secretly Muslim, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was like, well, there are rumors Rihanna's really Muslim. Don't go tweet that. Or Rihanna, or however Oprah pronounces it, that's the right way. Whitney Houston technically passed away as a Muslim. There's sources that confirm that. But what you're trying to say is like there's no icon that you could be like, oh, that's a Muslim. Okay. Yes.
Like for example, in the video, when she said Saudi Arabia, the guy automatically said that it's like customs, don't go there, that's not really, that's what you do down here. So I feel like once somebody can feel distinguish the two, then they can recognize, they can tell misconceptions from that.
Okay. Yes. What's your name?
Mama.
Mama. Can you speak a little bit louder? Sir?
Okay, so I think they just get like one side and then one woman like cross highlight and overemphasize issues and just let people see it.
Okay, so like sensationalist media basically, right? Around issues that may not be mainstream, like, but that becomes the mainstream view. Okay. All right, so just for the sake of time, I'm going to go through this. So sensationalist media, how about misinterpretation of religious texts, right? So there is that going on. Obviously, in the Judeo-Christian faith, that's something that they know and they recognize. Anyone, well, I don't want to make you raise your hand, but those of you who are from the Judeo-Christian faith know that there's this idea of interpretive texts, right? That throughout the past, well, for the Jews, almost 3,000 years, and then for the Christians, about 2,000 years, you have this idea of, well, for the Jews, a little bit longer than that. Sorry for anyone who's studying theology. But there's this idea that, okay, there's text, and then there's an interpretation of that text, and people often differ on that. Within Islam, we have mainstream views within the Sunni school, which may seem more monolithic than the other religious traditions, but what's important, though, the piece that's important in this conversation is that there is religious, interpretive textual study going on, and just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, differences of opinion, that exists as well. And then the reality is that when we can't ignore this from this conversation, and for the Muslims in here, please don't think that like I'm trying to trash out dirty laundry of the Muslim community, but the truth is that we have our problems, right? And like I'm saying this as a person who loves Islam, who is a Muslim, who loves God, and I consider myself a very committed Muslim. But that doesn't mean that there are people in our community who are not behaving as Muslims, right? And then, of course, what they do to the women, or vice versa, is sometimes, as Imam has stated, that becomes like the mainstream view, and unfortunately that causes problems for the larger framework, right? For Muslims. Well, Okay, I didn't know I was gonna do that. But there you go, to whoever said lack of knowledge. Okay, so apologies to anyone in here who's offended by this picture, but I think it's important. So here's this image of a woman in a face veil, a woman who's probably in a bikini, I think. Maybe she's wearing a skirt, can't tell, it's too short anyway. And then you have a Catholic ordained, not ordained, sorry, a Catholic nun, right? So you have three images. What's striking about this? Yes? Dahlia?
One's probably seen as oppressed and one liberated and one devout.
Wow, that's really good. Can you say that louder?
One is probably seen as oppressed, one liberated, and one devout.
Would you guys agree with that? So she basically said, from left to right, oppressed, liberated, devout, right? That's the common image, because the woman on the left, well, we can talk more about why that exists, and some of those misconceptions we already talked about, but when a Catholic nun hovers, it's like, when I'm at the airport, I'm telling you, TSA is like, wow, like somebody holy is coming through, right? When I'm going through, it's like they're like not even gonna talk to me. They're like, you know, and I travel a lot, so it's like I'm used to that routine, right? So it's almost like this misconception that I don't even belong to this country. I'm not even from here, and I'm not trying to complain here. I know you guys aren't like, you know, my therapy here, but I've experienced this myself, right? And it's fine. I mean, I actually try to go talk to the nuns at the airport, and I've asked several of them, like, how is it when you're going through? And they're like, oh, they try to follow protocol with us too. You know, they're like, we've been asked to come aside. Their habit has been taken off as well. So I thought I was the only one, but apparently it's not true. So here's the two extremes. You have the girl in the bikini saying, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominant culture. And the other side, nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture, right? Both of them are thinking that of the other, and that's the truth, because if you heard what Hiba had to say in the video earlier, she made it very clear that she was a Muslim feminist in her own way, right? She was like, look, I'm not doing this because some guy's making me or some woman's making me. I'm doing this because it's a different opinion on female sexuality and the ability or the option to not reveal what she considers is not for public consumption, right? So the question I asked today is like, what lens are we using, right? That's the real question. Is that what happens often is that Americans actually are statistically some of the most open-minded people, right? And it doesn't seem that way, but it's compared to Europe, right? Compared to European countries, Americans tend to be more open-minded in the sense that they're willing to learn, but the bias obviously is there. So I'm not saying the bias isn't there. But if you travel the world, you'll notice that Americans tend to smile more, and I'm not just like shooting this out of nowhere. At the end of the presentation, there's like, you know, if anyone wants the research for this. But at the same time, Americans also do have their own biases, right, or bias, and sometimes that's coming out of this idea that we want to project our version of democracy on other nations, right? And you've probably heard this before in a political science class somewhere. The question is, well, what do you consider, the question basically that I'm asking is it about difference or is it about deficiency, right? That's the question I'm asking, is what kind of lens are we using? So if you wanted to think of the other as lesser than you, or those who are being oppressed because they don't get to dress like you, there's plenty of examples of that, right? You have Nazi Germany, you have Native Americans being looked upon as savages, simply because they dressed different, they acted different, they had a completely different landscape, or how they use their landscape. You have African Americans still being mistreated, obviously. We've gone through the civil rights movement, but it took a lot to get there. And then, of course, even women, right? And the list goes on to, people who are overweight, to people who have a disability, right? There's this idea of, deficiency, right? Rather than just saying, okay, this person is different, right? Does that make sense? So the question I guess I have for you today is like, the second question is like, what is feminism? Who's took like a women's gender studies class so far here? Or, I don't know if they have a program here for gender studies, right? I'm assuming they do. Yeah. Who's took like a class on feminism or on women's issues or like women in gender studies? What are you guys all engineers? Or pre-med? Probably. Except the white people.
I'm just gonna.
Men and women. Okay, thank you. What's your name? Summer?
Well, there's like different brands of it. Like the ones that we're used to is a very specific Western feminism, but then there's like neo-liberal feminism.
Okay. So you took a class on this?
I mean, I kind of.
One more thing.
I was gonna say sometimes it's to the extent that women feel like they should be more special and aspect more over than men. So
It sometimes feels like that, you're saying?
I'm saying as in they're trying to put out that they're equal to men, but in that scenario, they're still going to feel more welcome.
Okay, so perhaps that has, in some ways, that's what it seems like to some people. Or some people actually believe that that should be the case in order to bring that balance back.
I mean, like, through trying to equalize women with men, but you're somewhat putting women above men, so that's not in society.
Okay, so for the most part, right, postmodern feminism still, I mean, if you study the history of feminism, like, go to Google, right? I mean, you don't have to go to much, you have to Google. But it starts off, so my husband's a historian, so, right, like, gave me the spiel before I came, just to remind me. It starts off with what? The women's liberation movement starts where? Actually starts to end alcohol, right? And then it goes into the abolition movement. And eventually, right, as time moves on, you have this historic precedent of women who want to bring equality in all of these things, right? But then, of course, when we use it in our own urban context, sometimes you've heard of like, oh, a feminazi. Like if you really promote this idea of women, like the involvement of women, depending on where you live here, like even in the United States, you could be mistreated simply because you are like advocating for women's rights, right? Because people are like, oh, you're such a feminazi, right? Simply because you're actually saying, well, what about women? Are there women present in this context or whatnot? But then obviously there are people who are like, look, it's part of the culture now. We've shifted the culture, it's part of the culture, it's not a big deal, we don't need to talk about it. But the one thing that I do want to focus on around what you said, somebody here, Dahlia, that feminism in the Western world has its own journey, right, and its own narrative and its own legacy. And I think what you're trying to say maybe is that it cannot be superimposed on the same stories and narratives of people in the East, right? And I don't want to make this East and West contrast too much here because the world is global and we all know it's an ellipse, or not a sphere, an ellipse. So we know that, you know, it's not just about East or West, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that the story of women here, so for example, women taking off their bras and burning them, is not necessarily the same story of the people, right, of the East. So sometimes I think what happens is that when Muslim women will be talking about how it's liberating for her to wear hijab, like the other day I was sitting on the airplane and the lady sitting next to me was very offended. She said, look, you have no idea what my generation went through. She was 72 and she's like, you know, you could just sit next to me on a plane and talk about women's rights in Islam, blah, blah, blah. She was very like blunt. She's like, you think that you have all these rights, and you're a Muslim woman coming from, you know, some country that doesn't give you your rights, and you feel like you have the free range to tell me that, oh look, I have all these rights in Islam, but in fact, my generation worked hard so you can get them. And for a second, I had to pause, and I was like, you know what, you're right. You're absolutely right. Your generation did a lot. Your generation went through a lot to get basic rights for women, like voting and all of that. Then I tried to explain to her, though, that when I wear the hijab, it's not in any way trying to, you know, regress all the hard work that they put through in order for women to get their rights, right? In fact, I thanked her for doing what she did so that I can have the choice, really, right? And the freedom to still be a modern Muslim woman, postmodern Muslim woman, and practice my religion and participate in society and be treated as an equal and all of that, right? And it took her a while to understand my perspective, but at the same time, I think it's important for Muslim women in the audience here to understand that when it comes to feminists who are like really pro anti-hijab, I think it's just a matter for them to understand that we appreciate what they've done, right? We really appreciate all the hard work that they've been through, but our choice in wearing the veil is not necessarily to promote, men and their understanding of oppressing women, right? Rather, it's, in my perspective, it's in a way, and I agree with him on this part, that it's a choice that I've made, and it's a different form of reflecting on what it means to over-sexualize the female bodies. Everyone still with me? Okay. So, respect, reproductive choice, all of that. Sorry. Now, the Quran, now we're going to go into a little bit of the theological conversation, because I'm sure some of you are wondering, like, okay, well, when is the theology piece going to come in? What does the Quran say about men and women and things of that nature? So, the Quran is very clear on this idea that men and women are equal. There are plenty of verses that talk about that. Here's one of them. The Quran makes it clear that men and women are equal in every single way, including the level of piety. So it's in your act of piety that you can attain righteousness, not necessarily by your gender or your biological sex. So, but the main idea in Islam is that both men and women are doing acts of worship, but in a balanced way, right? So that they can stay members of civic society, that they can both contribute to society, and yet at the same time be, practicing of their faith and their values, and which leads to the ultimate goal, which is the pleasure of God. And I'm speaking specifically from the Islamic perspective, pleasure of God, and then hopefully an afterlife that's blessed. For Muslim women, when it comes to the theological conversation around why they wear the veil, you're going to get different opinions. Like, there are people in here who probably wear it on a daily basis, and in the end, maybe we can get some feedback. For me personally, September 11th occurred in my senior year of high school. Okay, so what that means is that all of the people that I was cool with, did you announce that in my bio that I played varsity basketball? No, right? Not that one. So, no, I gave that one, so I wanted people to be like, oh, she did. So, did she wear that thing or did she not, right? The hijab, did she wear it or did she not? So I actually wore the hijab while I played basketball at Malzos High School. And the Chicago Trib actually did an article on my sister, and I was mentioned there too, titled Uniformly Diverse Teams, right? On this idea that, oh look, these Muslim women are wearing their head veils, it's all tucked in, and we have our sweats on, and we're playing basketball. It was great, until September 11th occurred, because the same people who were like cool with me, so the guys, like all the jocks had a nickname for me. I was the ninja girl, I don't know why. I think it was like their way of being like, trying to like keep the coolness, but like I wouldn't give them high fives, so they would always be like, ah. I don't know if high school is still the same, but anyway, so the same referee who had seen me play for the last 3 years, obviously, stops the game a minute. Some of you have heard the story before. Stops the game a minute 34 seconds left in the clock, and says number 33, you're in violation of the IHSA Illinois rules for uniform conduct. And my coach was a hothead, who was a devout Catholic actually. Originally, on my first day of tryouts was like, are you going to wear that, like all of it? Like he was very questioning of it. But to my surprise, he was actually on the sideline, and he was like arguing with the ref, and they both knew each other, by the way. They would go out for drinks. I know he's a devout Catholic, but I guess that's not a problem. So he's basically arguing with him. He's like, we have all the paperwork to prove that she can wear that. And then he went on to say, not in my game, this is bigotry, not in my game, not in my game, not in my court, right? And then I was allowed to go back for the last 34 seconds, which made really no difference. But it was his way, the referee's way of saying that September 11th just happened, I'm ticked off, and it's because of people like you, right? Like, that's the association he made because of my head veil. So, afterwards, as I'm going to the locker room, a parent from the bleachers comes down and says, number 33, we turn around. He's like, it's a shame they let you back in, right? So there are all these concerns around the fact that, like, why do you wear that? You know, who are Muslims? Like, are you related to, like, the one time I did get something that was really offensive was like, oh, what are you related? Do you know where Bin Laden is hiding because are you related to him or something like that? That was not too funny. So that interaction was really hard, right? Think about a 17-year-old who's like trying to fit in all the time, because that's how high school is, and then you're questioning why you wear this, right? So I started reading a lot on Muslim women, right? And I wanted to understand why I wore it, right? Because to a certain extent, I will admit, because I was raised in a pretty traditional Muslim home, and some of the Muslim girls or women in here who have also been raised in a traditional Muslim home can probably relate to this. I also went to private Muslim school until grade 8. So in a way, was I indoctrinated to the idea of wearing a hijab? Of course I was, right? Like, I think anyone who is surrounded by a specific culture, you start to pick up the traits of that culture, right? So I started to question, like, why do I wear this? And do Muslim women actually question why they wear it? And what was it like for the earliest Muslim women? What was their story? So I'm going to share one of them with you because we don't have a lot of time for the rest. So from a theological perspective, in terms of who were the first Muslim women and what did they understand of Islam? The woman that I want to talk really quickly about is Sumayya bint al-Khayyat. So Sumayya, and some of you know this name already, any Muslim in here? Who is Sumayya? Or a man? The guy with the longest beard must know the answer. We're associating like imagery with piety right now. Just kidding. Who is Sumayya? You don't want to answer that?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. All right. See, that's just that's an example of how you shouldn't judge people by their cover, right?
She knows.
Yes, but I'm sure you probably know if I reminded you. Hafsa, you know?
Wasn't she the first martyr?
Yes. Okay. So most Muslims know her as the first woman or person even to have. Yes. Yes. So Ammar is this son of Sumayya, and the story goes that Ammar is one of the first 10 people to accept the message of the last prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he basically accepts Islam, and his mother knows, and he keeps leaving the house, right? He keeps leaving the house very, very early hours of the like pre-dawn. And one day she catches him, and she's really upset. She's like, where do you keep going? I know you keep going to Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he says, one day he finally says, look, Mom, what is it about Muhammad that you don't like? And she says, I respect him, right? I trust him. He is known as the one who cares for the poor and the one who cares for the needy, but I fear for you. I fear for your life because the local tribal leaders of the time were basically out, they knew about Muhammad, preaching this message, and just like Jesus, peace be upon him, the powers that be didn't really want him to, continue that message. So he tells her, Mother, just today verses were revealed, so the 7th chapter to be revealed in the Quran, and he recites the verses. He says, just today these verses were revealed. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنبٍ قُتِلَتْ The infant baby girl that was buried alive will ask, for what sin was it killed? Right? So as many of you know, pre-Islamic Arabian societies did what? Yeah, so female infanticide was a practice, right? It was a very common practice. They buried their daughters because it was considered shameful, and she was just a burden because you had to give money, right, to betroth her to somebody. When he recites that, she pauses, and she says, I remember that my father told me a story when I was young that he buried 3 of my older sisters alive, and when it came time for me, I held on to his finger, and he felt like his heart was going to be buried with me. So he didn't bury me, and I am in fact alive simply because of the mercy that was placed in his heart for me. So she remembers that. Narration goes, she's tearing up, and she says, if Muhammad has come to liberate women, I am for it. Right? And that's all she knew of Islam. Because a couple of days later, in fact, she actually is killed. Right? And that's why Muslims remember her as the first person who had sacrificed her life for Islam. Or the message of Islam. So the point I'm making here is like the earliest Muslim women basically understood that the message was very revolutionary for its time, right? The argument I get, however, whenever I bring this up in lectures, somebody will raise their hand and will say, well, that's great, but like, obviously today Muslim women are not liberated, right? Like, obviously it's not, Islam doesn't seem to be revolutionary today. But part of, hopefully, by the end of this lecture, the case I'm making is that what is liberation, what is revolutionary, is very much dependent on how one understands and practices their religion, right? And then how it could become productive for society, and where could it be potentially harmful, and what are those cases? So is everyone still on the same page as me? I know we started a little late, so I hope it's okay that we're going a little bit over. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to point out to you is that you also have to understand that the revelation of Quran, unlike the other, well actually, much like the Judeo-Christian text, happens over time, in the sense that, well, unless you, the 10 commandments don't obviously happen over time, but the revelation of Quran happens throughout the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, after the age of 40, right? Most of you know this. So the first 13 years actually happen in Mecca, and the next 10 happen in Medina. So what I'm trying to say, for those of you who are hearing this for the first time, is that Muslims believe Muhammad was 40, and he was in this cave called the Cave of Hira, and Gabriel comes to him and tells him to read or recite. He says, I can't, I'm unlettered. Muhammad didn't know how to read or write, by the way. This is why many Muslims consider the Quran to be a miracle, because it was given to somebody who had no idea how to read or write. So anyway, it happens in 610 CE, and then he passes away around 23 years later, and during this time, Gabriel's coming to him, and this message is being revealed over time. Why am I making this known in this discussion is because what you have to understand is that the earlier passages are pretty much about justice for everybody, for the slaves that are there in society, for the women. So verses like I shared with you around not burying your daughters alive. What happens though in the next 10 years is that the verses become more about like divorce, inheritance rights, treatment of women in terms of like making sure that they get inheritance, right? So the first 13 years, it's more about one God, the message of one God, and then in the next phase, it's more about building a civic society. So you should kind of know that. The last one here, some of the narrations of the Prophet. Hadith just means narration, or the saying of the Prophet Muhammad. A believer must not hate his wife, and if he is displeased with one bad quality in her, then let him be pleased with one that is good in her, right? The Prophet also said, among the believers who show most perfect faith are those who have the best disposition and are kindest to their families, and in another narration, kindest to their wives, right? So the Prophet constantly taught this idea. There's the Quran, and I'm going to go a little quickly. The Quran has many verses that talk about the spiritual equality of women and men. For example, this verse says Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women. It's about men and women, like literally both are stated, right? In terms of attitude towards them, it says treat them with kindness and equity, not just equality, but equity. Seek them for collaboration and consultation. There are many examples where the Prophet, peace be upon him, would go to his wife and say, look, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think? And like she would chime in, right? And she would say, I don't know about that. I think this is good. Or I don't think you should do this. Rights at 10 mosques. A lot of people ask me this question during the presentation, so I thought I'd put it in. There's a question about can Muslim women go to mosques? One of my colleagues said she went to India, and then she wanted to visit, she went to the temple, right, the Hindu temple and ashrams, and then she was hoping that she could go visit a mosque. Unfortunately, when she got to the masjid, like Muslims call it, this guy was like, no women allowed, right? And then she comes back to the United States and she's like, hey, listen, what happened? How come I wasn't allowed? And obviously the image that she got of Islam for women in India was very, very oppressive. And I had to explain to her that unfortunately, that's very much what's happening in that particular cultural context, and that is not the case, the mainstream case for Muslim women. So if you go to the Middle East, there are many places. Like when I was living in Egypt, I could always go to the mosque. There was no whatsoever issue. Sometimes it was in the same area as the men, I was just behind, or sometimes it was in a different room, but at least there was space there, right, for me to be there. Here are the narrations from, because this is also a theological conversation, I wanted to make sure that you actually see the sayings of the Prophet. He said, do not stop women from going to Allah's mosques. Allow women to go to the mosques at night even, right? So rights in terms of her right to property. She basically in pre-Islamic Arabian, in that context, Dr. Karen Armstrong, who is a historian, points out that, or makes the case that most women did not get to keep the inheritance, right, of their fathers. But the Prophet was very clear on that, the Quran is very clear on that. In terms of the education of women, the Quran is very clear on that. Is it okay if I kind of go a little quickly on these? Yeah? I'm just trying to show you that, like, I'm not just speaking out of, like, you know, oh, the Islam is great, whatever. I mean, there's actually context for this. There's text for it. Seeking knowledge is an obligation on every single Muslim. That's a famous hadith that almost every probably Muslim in here already knows. Do not beat them. The Prophet said very clearly, do not beat them, do not revile them, do not, you know, try to punish them. And then a very famous narration or hadith that I, you know, really think it's very important for anyone who gets married, and especially men who think that it's okay to beat their wives. The Prophet said, how can it be said that a man is the protector of his wife if he intentionally strikes, chokes, pushes, or is violent in any way that results in her physical injury or bruising, right? And he made it very clear that, like, you're not a man. Like, in fact, a man came up to the Prophet and he said, kind of did something wrong. And he said, well, what did you do? He said, I can't tell you. He said, well, what did you do? He said, I can't tell you. So then the third time he says, I bruised my wife, right? So basically hit her enough that she was bruised. And the Prophet, like, looked away, right? He didn't try to, like, tell him, like, you know, you're crazy. But he looked away and he said, when you're a man, come back. Right? And he, like, that was it, right? He's like, when you're a man, come back. And it's really kind of, like, when I read that, I was like, oh, shoot, like, that's pretty, you know, not cool. But it was very clear, like, if you read the narration of the Prophet Muhammad, it's very clear that he was pro-women, right, period. He was pro-men too, so it doesn't mean that he was choosing one over the other, but women, he really tried to make sure that women felt honored around him, and there are many, many examples of that. Right to marry, he made sure that the community knew that you can't just, like, betroth your daughter to somebody. So, for example, when somebody here said arranged marriages, it's very clear, like in Islamic law, mainstream Islamic law, that you cannot marry your daughter against her will. So a famous narration of the Prophet, a woman comes up to him and says, my father just married me to somebody that I don't like. And the Prophet basically said, okay, this marriage is annulled, like, it didn't even happen because your choice wasn't part of the deal. She goes, no, I like the person. And he's like, okay. And he says, I did that because I want all the women to know, all the Muslim women to know that their choice matters, right? So the Prophet's like, all right, like, I mean, I don't know if he said all right. I'm just adding that. I'm sure he was, well, I can't say that. That's theologically wrong for me to do that, if I did that. But anyway, the Quran basically makes it clear that the idea of marriage is tranquility. So you cannot have tranquility, right? You cannot be true to the verse of the Quran to establish tranquility if two people who don't like each other, or one person has no idea who she's marrying, unless you watch that movie, Namesake. Somehow it worked out. You guys know what I'm talking about? But they're obviously not Muslim, right? Prior to Islam, pagan Arabs and only men could inherit. I think I've already said some of this. But for Muslim women, right, the idea of the right to vote, the idea of inheritance, right to divorce, all of that actually was promised to us 1,400 years ago, right, over 1,400 years ago. So our claim is that, look, Islam actually gives Muslim women many, many rights that the West has actually caught up to, right, in some ways. But at the same time, it doesn't now mean that we just blame the West for all the problems that we have, but we look to resolving the issues that our own community faces, right? And I think that's really important too. So two things that I want to also bring up to you. Sorry if it's going a little bit longer. Al-Muhaddithat, has anyone heard of this text? No one? Usman, have you heard of this text? Yes? I'm sorry?
Yes.
So who are Al-Muhaddithat?
The women's salvation of Islam.
does it mean to be a muhaddith?
Someone who can study, who knows hadith.
Good. That's really close. Okay. So a muhaddith, according to mainstream Islam, is somebody who has memorized over 400,000 hadith of the Prophet. And not only memorized the hadith, but also the background of the chain. So like the people in the chain, the
Can you
narrators.
explain the chains?
So there's Quran, right? For Muslims, there's two main sources: Quran, which is 6,236 verses, and then you have hadith, which are narrations of the Prophet. So basically, it's the teachings and the sayings of the Prophet, right? So the Gospels, right, are what? The teachings and sayings of Jesus, right? So it's the recording of the four at least the what's now available. It's his 4 disciples that record what he said, right? So within Islam, though, there are many disciples, right? And then they passed it on. So for example, if I said something to Zahra, and Zahra said something to Hafsa, and Hafsa said something to Yelena, and then Yelena said something to Solomon, and Uzma, then all the other people in here, right? And then the last person in the chain, let's say, is another name, Umama. Okay, Umama, there we go. Sorry, I'm trying to memorize names here. So if Umama basically says, I know what Tahera Ahmad said, but she can basically go through she has to go through the chain. She has to say, I heard that Tahera Ahmad had a latte at Starbucks from Solomon, who heard it from all the people. Get it? So that's the chain. And Muslims are really careful on that because it's the idea of validating what the Prophet said. Okay? So hadith is very important, right, for Muslims. So what I'm trying to explain here, though, is that the question I often get is, it's great. Muslim women seem to be very educated now. Well, what the heck happened in the last 200, 300 years, 250 years, right? Like, that's a very common question, right? Like, if you look at parts of the world, like South Asia, parts of North India, parts of West Africa, North Africa, you see that women are not only, in many ways, in the last 200 years, not only have they been prevented from being educated, but oppressed, right? So the question is, did Islam, and also for Muslim women in here, how many of you actually know like Muslim female scholars being like part of the conversation, right? Often it's like, where are the female scholars, right? Even throughout our history, you always hear about these great names of like, you know, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah or Imam al-Ghazali, right? How many of you actually hear of like somebody quoting like a famous Muslim, right? Like a female Muslim scholar. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that that's true. It's true that in our legacy, it seems like that's a missing piece. But recently, a scholar at Oxford, Muhammad Akram Nadwi, spent the last 20 years researching Muslim female scholars, right? So this work actually came out a couple of years ago. And what's awesome is that he not only names, but he finds out the routes that they used to take in order to teach and preach. So without getting into detail, at least one of them, for example, was Fatima bint Muhammad. She basically was somebody who was Grand Muftiya, so to speak. And so a mufti is a person who gives ruling, right? So it's like the highest form of being in charge, so to speak. So when people ask, well, can a Muslim woman be in like some kind of leadership? Of course, like it's been done. It's not like some kind of rare thing that's never happened in Islam. Today you see Muslim women who wear the veil, who are scientists, who are studying. This is at Azhar. iCover goes through a bunch of different Muslim women who are living today. If you don't have a copy, maybe you should get one. Sada Sayyid, who's with President Obama over there, is a photojournalist, and she has this photo documentary. Ibtihaj Muhammad is somebody else that you all should know. She was on the U.S. Olympic team. She's a fencer. She can probably fence better than all the guys I know. That's. I mean, I know two, I guess. Basically, she could take anybody down that I know, I guess, in fencing. She was also, I got to meet her at the White House, so I'm like excited about that. But anyway, there are lots of other Muslim women. We don't have time to get into each one of them, but I think it's important for you to see that Muslim women, the ones who are veiled at least in these pictures, obviously not all Muslim women wear the veil, but those who do, are they practicing their, Islam as well as being active members of society. Clearly, you have a fitness trainer, Mubaraka. You have Dr. Amina McLeod, who's right here in Chicago. Intisar Rub just got inducted to the faculty at Harvard as a tenured professor. So you have women doing awesome, amazing things. The Bahraini runner, these are Iranian women playing rugby, I think. You have top-rated physicians. For example, this lady is in the top 10 pediatricians in Chicago. You have Kung Fu going on. Dr. Ingrid Mattson, who's a religious leader. But on the other hand, you have this whole idea that we started with, which is as much as like Muslim women seem to be like really, doing awesome things, obviously there's still this idea that it's preventing women from exploring their civic opportunities. The truth is that the hijab ban is more about the niqab now than it is about the hijab. That's one thing that you should know. But the issue really is about discrimination, right? So if a Muslim woman chooses to cover, okay, yes, there are women who are being abused and they're being forced to cover, and that shouldn't happen, and it's unfortunate that it happens, and we have to work to prevent that. But for those who do, right, and they're good people, they're trying to be good members of civic society, they're good students, they're good wives, they're good mothers, so on and so forth, should they not be given the chance to then explore opportunities? Obviously, when they're discriminated against, that's actually a problem. So then President Obama, when he was in Cairo, said something very important. To avoid dictating what clothes a Muslim